The sound of my granddaughter's trembling whisper still haunts me, the words so fragile yet shattering my whole world. It was him, my dad. I will never forget the weight of that moment. How the sterile hospital room around us became a prison of silent terror. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. Every morning, I dragged myself out of bed in my small Queens apartment, the sound of garbage trucks rumbling down Northern Boulevard mixing with the distant hum of the subway. The sun crept between my cracked blinds, casting long shadows across my worn hardwood floors. Dust motes danced in that early light like broken memories, floating aimlessly in the stale air that smelled of yesterday's coffee and the faint scent of my neighbor's cooking. My routine had become a prison of repetition. I'd shuffle to my tiny kitchen, my arthritis making each step a small victory, and start baking Emma's favorite blueberry muffins. The smell would fill my apartment with sweetness, but it couldn't mask the bitterness that had settled in my heart like sediment in an old teacup. I'd check her medications, organizing the pills in their weekly container with the same precision I once used to balance my checkbook when I had money to balance. Then I'd sit beside her hospital bed, my hands folded in my lap, watching her chest rise and fall with each precious breath. My fingers looked so old then, mapped with blue veins and brown spots that reminded me of my mother's hands in her final years. Emma was only 8 years old, but she carried herself with the weight of someone much older, her eyes holding secrets that no child should ever have to keep. Beneath the surface of our daily routine, my heart ached with questions I couldn't voice. Why was Emma in the hospital so often? Why did her father, Michael, always seem to have an excuse when she needed him most? Why did the doctors ask such careful questions about how she'd gotten her injuries? I pushed these thoughts away like unwelcome visitors, telling myself I was imagining things, that the stress of caring for a sick grandchild was making me paranoid. Last week, I had carefully arranged a family dinner at my apartment, hoping against hope for some connection, some warmth in our fractured family. I spent my last $60 on groceries, buying Michael's favorite pot roast and those expensive dinner rolls from the bakery on Astoria Boulevard. I set my mother's good china on the table, the plates with the tiny pink roses that had survived 3 generations of careful handling. But when Michael walked through my door, I saw it immediately in his eyes, that cold, distant look that had replaced the warmth I remembered from his childhood. He barely glanced at the table I'd set, barely acknowledged the meal I'd prepared with such care. When I asked about Emma's latest doctor visit, he shrugged and looked at his phone. When I mentioned that her medical bills were piling up, he turned away dismissively. "Mom, you worry too much," he said, not even looking at me. "Emma's fine. Kids get sick sometimes." But I could see it in Emma's face, the way she flinched when her father raised his voice, the way she instinctively moved closer to me whenever he entered the room. There was fear there, deep and primal, the kind of fear that comes from living with a monster disguised as a parent. That night, after they left, I sat in my worn recliner and let the memories wash over me. I remembered Michael as a boy, his laughter echoing through Flushing Meadows Park on cold New York afternoons when I'd take him there after school. I could still smell his little boy scent, that mixture of playground dirt and bubble gum that would cling to his jacket when he hugged me tight. Back then, he would tell me everything, his fears about tests, his excitement about baseball games, his dreams of becoming a firefighter. Where had that sweet boy gone? When had he become this stranger who looked at me like I was nothing more than an inconvenience? I remember when Michael was 7 years old, the same age Emma is now. I was working 2 jobs then, cleaning offices at night and watching other people's children during the day. Money was always tight, but I never let him know how desperately we struggled. When he needed new shoes for school, I sold my mother's pearl earrings, the only valuable thing I'd inherited. When he wanted to join Little League, I took on extra hours cleaning the Kowalski family's house every weekend. "Mom, can you help me with money for college?" he asked when he was 18, standing in my kitchen with his acceptance letter from Queens College, his face bright with possibility. Without hesitation, I emptied my savings account. Every dollar I'd scraped together working overtime, every penny I'd saved by eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner, I gave it all to him. Because that's what mothers do. We sacrifice everything for our children's dreams. When he got married to Jennifer, I spent my last $1,000 on their wedding gift. When Emma was born, I used what little remained in my retirement account to help them with the down payment on their house in Elmhurst. When Michael lost his job during the recession, I gave him money for rent, for groceries, for whatever he needed to keep his family afloat. "You're the best mom in the world," he used to tell me, hugging me tight after each financial bailout. "I don't know what we'd do without you." But as the years passed, something shifted. The warm hugs became quick pecks on the cheek. The grateful phone calls became demanding texts. The visits became shorter, cooler, more mechanical. "Mom, Emma needs new school clothes," Jennifer would say during their brief visits, not even bothering to ask how I was doing. "The car needs repairs again," Michael would add, already calculating in his head how much he could get from me. I'd write the checks without complaint, telling myself this was love, this was family. But deep inside, a small voice began to whisper doubts. Was I just an ATM to them? Had my love become nothing more than a transaction? One evening, as I prepared Emma's favorite mac and cheese in my tiny kitchen, I worked up the courage to voice my growing concern. "Son," I said carefully, my voice barely above a whisper, "do you think you could visit more often? Not just when you need something, but just to spend time together?" Michael looked up from his phone with irritation. "I'm busy, Mom. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Between work and Jennifer and Emma, I barely have time to breathe. But Emma loves spending time here," I pressed gently. "And I miss—" "Look, Mom," he interrupted, that familiar dismissive shrug cutting through my words like a knife. "You don't get it. You had it easy raising just one kid. I've got responsibilities you can't even imagine." That shrug, cold, manipulative, final, planted a seed of doubt that would grow in my heart like a weed. Was I really just a safety net to them? Had the years of sacrifice, the decades of unconditional love, been reduced to nothing more than what I could provide financially? The silence that followed his words was deafening. Even Emma, usually chattering away about her school friends or her favorite cartoons, sat quietly at the table, her small fingers picking at her food. She glanced between her father and me with those two wise eyes, already learning to read the dangerous moods of the adults around her. That night, after they left, I sat alone in my apartment and tried to remember the last time Michael had asked about my health, my dreams, my fears. I couldn't. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had become invisible to my own son, valuable only for what I could give, not for who I was. The microaggressions started small, almost too subtle to notice at first. My birthday came and went without acknowledgement. I waited all day for a phone call, a text, anything. By evening, I called Michael myself. "Oh, happy birthday, Mom," he said with the enthusiasm of someone remembering a dental appointment. "Sorry, it's been crazy here." No card arrived the next week. No belated celebration was planned. Christmas morning, I wrapped presents with care. A new tablet for Michael, expensive perfume for Jennifer, and a collection of art supplies for Emma, who had shown such talent in her drawings. I put on my best dress, the navy blue one with the pearl buttons that I'd worn to her baptism, and waited. No one came. At 3 o'clock, I called Michael. "Are you still coming for Christmas dinner?" "Oh, Mom, didn't Jennifer call you? We decided to stay home this year. Emma's been tired and we thought it would be better to have a quiet Christmas at our place." But I knew Jennifer hadn't called. I would have remembered. They had made plans that didn't include me and they forgot to tell me. I spent Christmas Day alone, eating leftover turkey and watching old movies. My carefully prepared feast growing cold on the counter. When I caught a cold that turned into bronchitis last winter, I lay in bed for 3 days. Too weak to get up, too proud to call and beg for help. My phone sat silent on the nightstand. No concerned calls came, no offers to bring soup or medicine. I had to take the bus to the emergency room by myself, wheezing and dizzy, because I was afraid I might have pneumonia. The doctor asked if I had family who could check on me. Yes, I lied, because admitting the truth felt like admitting failure as a mother. But the breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I was cleaning Emma's room in my apartment. She stayed with me sometimes when her parents needed a babysitter. When I found a stack of papers shoved behind her toy box. Medical bills. Dozens of them. Hospital stays, emergency room visits, specialist consultations, all under Emma's name, all unpaid. The amounts were staggering. Thousands and thousands of dollars in medical debt that I knew Michael couldn't afford on his mechanic's salary. But more troubling were the dates and the descriptions. Emergency room visits for accidental falls, x-rays for playground injuries, consultations with pediatric orthopedists for repeated bone fractures in various stages of healing. My hands shook as I read through each bill, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. These weren't bills for a child with a chronic illness. These were bills for a child who was being hurt, again and again, by someone she should have been able to trust. I sat on Emma's tiny bed, surrounded by her stuffed animals and coloring books, and felt my world crack open. How had I missed this? How had I been so focused on the financial manipulation, the emotional neglect, that I'd failed to see the real horror happening right under my nose? That afternoon, as I sat in my kitchen trying to make sense of what I'd discovered, I reached for my mother's teacup. white porcelain with tiny blue flowers, a wedding gift from 1952 that had somehow survived decades of careful use. But my hands were trembling so badly that the delicate handle slipped from my fingers. The cup shattered on the kitchen floor, pieces scattering like my fractured heart. I knelt among the broken porcelain and wept silently, tears streaming down my face as I tried to gather the pieces. But some things, once broken, can never be put back together the same way. The cup was gone, and so was my illusion that I was dealing with nothing more than an ungrateful son and a financially struggling family. This was bigger than emotional neglect. This was about Emma's safety. For the first time in 73 years, I allowed myself to think the unthinkable. What if saying no to my family wasn't abandonment? What if it was protection? What if choosing my own well-being wasn't selfish, but necessary? The fear that had controlled my life for so long, the terror of being alone, of being unloved, of being forgotten, suddenly seemed less important than the fear growing in my chest about Emma's safety. My granddaughter needed someone to stand up for her, even if it meant standing against her own father. That evening, I carefully gathered Emma's medical bills and placed them in a manila folder. I packed away the photographs of Michael's childhood, the ones that showed his gap-toothed grin and dirt-stained knees, because looking at them felt like staring into the face of a stranger. And I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, really looking at myself for the first time in years. I saw a woman who had given everything and received crumbs in return. I saw a grandmother who had been so desperate to buy love that she'd allowed herself to become complicit in something monstrous. I saw someone who needed to find her voice before it was too late. The breaking point came the next day when Michael called, his voice casual and demanding. "Hey, Mom, can you watch Emma this weekend? Jennifer and I want to go to Atlantic City with some friends." "Michael," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "we need to talk about Emma's medical bills." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. "What medical bills?" he finally asked, but I could hear the defensiveness creeping into his tone. "The ones hidden in her room at my apartment, the emergency room visits, the broken bones, all those accidents that keep happening. Mom, kids get hurt. Emma's clumsy, you know that. She falls a lot. But I'd been a mother, and now I was a grandmother. I knew the difference between childhood accidents and something darker. No child falls enough to rack up this many hospital bills, Michael. And no parent hides these bills unless they're ashamed of how those injuries happened. You're being ridiculous," he snapped, his voice taking on that edge I'd heard more and more often lately. "Emma's fine. She's just accident-prone. Then why didn't you tell me about the bills? Why are they hidden in my apartment?" "Because I knew you'd overreact just like you're doing now." Overreact. The word hit me like a slap. How many times had he used that word to dismiss my concerns, my feelings, my very valid questions about the welfare of my granddaughter? "I want to see Emma," I said firmly. "I want to talk to her." "No," Michael said quickly. She's staying with Jennifer's mother this week. Some stomach bug going around. But Jennifer's mother lived in Florida. Emma had school. Nothing about his story made sense. "Michael, where is Emma really?" "Mom, stop. You're making this weird. Emma's where she needs to be." The line went dead. My own son had hung up on me when I'd expressed concern for his daughter's safety. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Emma's too quiet voice when her father was around, the way she'd flinch at sudden movements, the careful way she'd position herself always within reach of me when we were alone together. Signs I'd seen but dismissed, warnings I'd ignored because I couldn't believe my own son was capable of hurting his child. When I confronted my daughter Sarah the next day, hoping for support, she immediately jumped to Michael's defense. "Mom, don't you think you're making this a bigger deal than it is?" she said, using almost the exact same words Michael had used. "Kids get hurt. It's normal. Sarah, have you seen the medical bills? Have you looked at the pattern of these injuries? Look, Mom, I don't want to get in the middle of this. Michael's got enough stress without you adding to it with these crazy accusations." Crazy accusations. My concern for my granddaughter's welfare had become crazy accusations in my family's eyes. The gaslighting was so complete, so thorough, that even I began to doubt what I'd seen with my own eyes. My youngest daughter, Lisa, was even less supportive when I called her in California. "Mom, you're getting older," she said with false gentleness. "Sometimes when we're isolated, we start imagining things that aren't there. Maybe you should talk to someone about this obsession with Michael." Obsession, imagination, age-related confusion. They had an excuse for everything except the truth, that Emma was in danger and I was the only one willing to see it. But then came the emotional blackmail, wrapped in guilt and delivered with surgical precision. "Without us, where would you be, Mom?" Michael asked during our next tense phone conversation. You'd be completely alone. No grandchildren to visit, no family dinners, no reason to get out of bed in the morning. Is that really what you want? The threat was clear. Question us and lose us. Choose Emma's safety over our comfort, and we'll cut you out completely. For most of my life, that threat would have worked. The fear of abandonment had controlled every decision I'd made since my husband died 15 years ago. I'd swallowed my pride, ignored red flags, and enabled bad behavior, all in the name of keeping my family together. But something had shifted inside me. Maybe it was the image of Emma's frightened face, or maybe it was the realization that I was already alone, surrounded by people who saw me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. The only person who seemed to understand was Maria Santos, Emma's nurse at the children's hospital where she'd been treated so many times. Maria was a gentle woman in her 50s from the Bronx, with warm brown eyes and laughter that sounded like comfort itself. She never asked directly about Emma's home situation, but I could see the concern in her face every time my granddaughter came in with another accident. One day, while Emma was having x-rays of her latest injury, a spiral fracture of her forearm that she claimed happened when she fell off her bike, Maria sat beside me in the waiting room. "You know," she said quietly, not looking directly at me, "I've been a pediatric nurse for 23 years. I've seen a lot of kids come through these doors." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Some patterns. They tell a story. And sometimes the people who love these kids the most are the ones who see the truth first." She handed me a small card with a phone number on it. "This is for the Children's Advocacy Center. They have people who know how to help in complicated family situations." I slipped the card into my purse, my hands shaking. Someone else saw what I saw. Someone else understood that Emma's injuries weren't normal childhood accidents. For the first time in months, I didn't feel completely alone. "Thank you," I whispered, and Maria squeezed my hand with understanding that spoke louder than words. The decision to stop enabling came slowly, then all at once. Michael called on a Thursday afternoon, his voice carrying that familiar, expectant tone. "Mom, the transmission went out on Jennifer's car. We need about $800 to get it fixed. Can you help us out?" For 73 years, I had said yes to every request, every demand, every manipulation disguised as need. I had sacrificed my comfort, my security, my self-respect to keep my family happy. But as I held the phone in my trembling hand, I thought about Emma's medical bills, about the injuries that kept happening, about the lies that kept coming. "No," I said. The word came out so quietly I wasn't sure Michael had heard it. "What did you say?" I said no, Michael. "I can't give you money anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the explosion I'd expected, but never experienced. "What do you mean, no?" "Mom, we need this car. Jennifer has to get to work. I understand that, but I can't help you anymore. I'm worried about Emma, and until we can have an honest conversation about her injuries, I need to step back. This is ridiculous. You're punishing us because you've got some crazy idea in your head about Emma. She's fine, Mom. She's a normal kid who has normal accidents. Normal kids don't have spiral fractures from falling off bikes, Michael. How dare you question my parenting? I would never hurt Emma. Never!" But his protest sounded hollow, desperate. And for the first time in our relationship, I wasn't backing down. "Then let me see her. Let me spend time with her alone. If everything is fine, you shouldn't have any problem with that." "We're done with this conversation," he said coldly. "And we're done with you if you're going to make these kinds of accusations." He hung up again, but this time I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. That night, I slept better than I had in months. For the first time in years, I'd chosen truth over peace, principles over popularity. My apartment felt different somehow. Not lonely, but quiet in a peaceful way. The constant anxiety that had settled in my chest like a permanent weight began to lift slightly. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done since my husband died. I called a therapist. Dr. Rebecca Walsh's office was in a community center in Astoria, a bright room with comfortable chairs and peaceful artwork on the walls. She was probably 50, with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Tell me why you're here," she said gently. And for the first time in years, I told someone the whole truth. About the financial manipulation, about Emma's suspicious injuries, about my family's dismissive attitude toward my concerns, about feeling invisible in my own life. "It sounds like you're dealing with multiple forms of abuse," Dr. Walsh said after I'd finished. "Financial exploitation from your son, emotional manipulation from your family, and you're witnessing what appears to be child abuse of your granddaughter." Hearing someone else name what I'd been experiencing gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. My concerns were valid. And my decision to say no was not only appropriate, it was necessary. "What do I do now?" I asked. "You continue to trust your instincts," she said, "and you start making decisions based on what's right, not what's comfortable." Over the next few weeks, I began to understand how completely I'd been manipulated. Dr. Walsh helped me see the patterns of emotional abuse that had been so normalized in my family that I'd stopped recognizing them. The guilt trips, the financial demands disguised as emergencies, the way my concerns were dismissed as overreacting or imagining things, the way my love had been weaponized against me, used to extract money, time, and compliance while giving nothing in return. But most importantly, she helped me understand that protecting Emma might mean making choices that felt impossible. "Sometimes," Dr. Walsh said during one of our sessions, "love requires us to do things that feel like betrayal. Sometimes protecting someone means standing against the people who claim to love them." I thought about that conversation as I walked home through my neighborhood in Queens, past the bodega where I bought my morning coffee, past the park where I used to push Emma on the swings, past the church where I'd prayed so many nights for my family's happiness. But now I was praying for something different, the courage to do what was right instead of what was expected. The confrontation I'd been avoiding finally came through a Zoom call that Michael had arranged, ostensibly to clear the air about our recent disagreements. Sarah and Lisa were on the call too, their faces filling separate squares on my laptop screen, all of them united against me. "Mom, this has gone far enough," Sarah began, her voice carrying the tone of an adult speaking to a confused child. "You're tearing the family apart with these accusations." "We think you need help," Lisa added. "Maybe it's time to consider assisted living, somewhere you can get the support you need." Assisted living. They were suggesting I was incompetent, that my concerns about Emma were signs of mental decline rather than valid observations about child abuse. "I am not confused," I said firmly, looking directly into the camera. "I am not imagining things. And I am not going anywhere until Emma is safe." Michael's face was hard, angry. "Mom, you're forcing me to cut you out of our lives. Is that really what you want? Do you want to lose your family over some fantasy you've created? If by family you mean people who exploit me financially and ignore my concerns about child abuse, then maybe losing that family isn't a loss at all." The words came out stronger than I'd expected, fueled by months of therapy and a growing understanding of my own worth. "You're sick, Mom," Michael said coldly. "You need professional help." "I am getting professional help," I replied, "and she's helping me understand that what I've been experiencing is called abuse." Jennifer appeared on screen next to Michael, her face twisted with false concern. "We hate to do this, but we can't have Emma around someone who makes these kinds of accusations. It's not healthy for her. What's not healthy for her is being hurt and having no one willing to protect her. That's it," Michael said, his voice final. "We're done. Don't call us anymore. Don't try to see Emma. You've made your choice." But before he could end the call, I did something I'd been planning for weeks. I reached beside my laptop and picked up an old photograph. Michael, at age 7, grinning at the camera with missing front teeth, grass stains on his little league uniform, my arms wrapped around him in a hug that had once meant everything to both of us. Slowly, deliberately, while they all watched through their screens, I tore the photograph in half. The symbolism was clear. I was tearing away the illusion I'd held onto for so long, the fantasy that the sweet little boy in that picture still existed somewhere inside the man who was now threatening to cut me out of his daughter's life to hide his abuse. "Mom, no," Sarah gasped, but I wasn't finished. "I will no longer buy love," I said, looking directly into the camera with steady eyes. "I will not pay for the privilege of being manipulated and dismissed. I will not enable abuse for the sake of keeping peace. Respect me, or lose me." The silence that followed was profound. For perhaps the first time in 60 years, I had spoken my truth without apology, without trying to soften the blow or make others comfortable with my reality. "And if you hurt Emma again," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word, "I will call the police. I will call Child Protective Services. I will do whatever it takes to protect her, even if it means losing all of you." Michael's face had gone pale. "You wouldn't dare. Try me." I reached over and ended the call myself, leaving them to sit with the reality of what I'd just said. For the first time in our relationship, I had hung up on them instead of the other way around. That night, I sat in my quiet apartment and felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: pride in myself. I had stood up to people who had counted on my weakness, my need for approval, my fear of abandonment. I had chosen truth over comfort, justice over peace. But I underestimated how far my family would go to discredit me. 3 days after our Zoom confrontation, I woke up to dozens of notifications on my phone. Concerned neighbors were texting. Old friends were calling. My phone was buzzing constantly with messages I didn't understand. When I finally opened Facebook, I saw the post that had been shared across multiple neighborhood groups. A lengthy message from Jennifer, written with calculated precision to make me look like a delusional old woman who was harassing her innocent family. It breaks my heart to share this publicly, but we need the community's support in dealing with a difficult family situation. My husband's mother has been making false accusations about our family, threatening us, and creating a hostile environment for our daughter. We've tried to handle this privately, but her behavior has escalated to the point where we fear for our safety and our child's well-being. If you see this elderly woman approaching our home or our daughter's school, please call us immediately. We love her, but she needs professional help that we can't provide. The post included my full name, my address, and a photo of me taken without my knowledge, probably during one of my visits to their house. I looked elderly and confused in the picture. Exactly the image Jennifer wanted to project. The comments that followed were brutal. Neighbors I'd known for years were expressing sympathy for Michael and Jennifer, offering to help them get a restraining order against me. People were calling me obviously mentally ill and a danger to that poor child. The humiliation was devastating. I'd lived in Queens for over 40 years, built relationships in this community, been known as a kind and reliable neighbor. Now I was being painted as a crazy old woman who was terrorizing a young family. The old me would have crumbled under this attack. The old me would have called Michael immediately, begging for forgiveness, promising to be quiet, if only they'd take down the post and let me back into their lives. But something had changed. Instead of rage or panic, I felt a strange calm settling over me. This public humiliation was exactly what Dr. Walsh had warned me about. Abusers often escalate their tactics when their victims start setting boundaries. The smear campaign wasn't evidence that I was wrong. It was evidence that I was right. I closed Facebook without responding to a single comment. I turned off my phone's notifications. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my favorite chair, looking out at the Queens skyline as the sun set behind the buildings. They wanted me to fight back, to defend myself publicly, to get pulled into a drama that would make me look unhinged, but I chose silence. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of someone who knows her own truth and doesn't need external validation to maintain it. My calm, unshaken response to their public attack was more powerful than any defense I could have mounted. By refusing to engage, I proved that my transformation wasn't fragile or temporary. It was real, deep, and unshakable. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood gossip died down. Most people moved on to other dramas, other concerns, but I could still feel the stares sometimes when I walked to the grocery store. Still heard the whispered conversations that stopped when I approached. It didn't matter. Their opinions had no power over me anymore. 2 months after the Facebook incident, I did something that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. I booked a trip. Maria had mentioned that she was taking a weekend trip to upstate New York to visit the fall foliage, and she'd invited me to join her. The old me would have declined immediately, worried about the cost, concerned about what my family would think, afraid to be away from my phone in case they needed something. But the new me said yes without hesitation. We took a Greyhound bus from Port Authority, winding through the Hudson Valley as the October leaves painted the landscape in brilliant reds and golds. Maria chattered about her own family struggles, a divorced daughter, an aging mother, the challenges of being the family's emotional caretaker, and I realized how universal these experiences were. "You know what I learned in my 50s?" Maria said as we hiked through a state park, our breath visible in the crisp air. "I learned that being a good mother or grandmother doesn't mean accepting abuse. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is set boundaries." We stopped at a scenic overlook, the valley spreading out below us like a painting. I breathed in the clean mountain air and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: pure joy. Not joy dependent on someone else's approval or happiness, but joy that came from within, from the simple pleasure of being alive and free. That trip marked the beginning of my rebirth in ways I hadn't expected. When I returned to Queens, I looked at my apartment with new eyes. The cluttered space that had felt oppressive now felt full of possibility. I spent the next month transforming my living space. I donated bags of old clothes that I'd kept just in case to charity. I bought new curtains that let in more light. I rearranged my furniture to create a reading nook by the window where I could watch the street life below while enjoying my morning coffee. New clothes appeared in my closet. Not expensive, but chosen for me, because I liked how they looked and felt, not because they were practical or invisible. A soft blue sweater that brought out my eyes. A red scarf that made me feel bold. Comfortable shoes that supported my walks through the neighborhood. But the most significant change was internal. I started waking up in the mornings without the heavy dread that had been my companion for so long. I made plans based on what I wanted to do rather than what others expected from me. I joined a book club at the library. I volunteered at a local food pantry. I began painting again, something I hadn't done since Michael was young. Most importantly, I maintained my boundaries. When Sarah called to test the waters, suggesting that maybe I'd been a little harsh and should reach out to apologize to Michael, I held firm. I won't apologize for protecting Emma or for demanding respect, I told her. If Michael wants a relationship with me, he knows what needs to change. He hadn't called. Not once since our Zoom confrontation. And while the old me would have taken this as confirmation that I'd made a terrible mistake, the new me understood it differently. His continued silence proved that his love had always been conditional, dependent on my compliance and financial support. Emma, however, was a different story. The breakthrough came 4 months after I'd lost my family. I was grocery shopping at the Key Food on Northern Boulevard when I heard a small voice behind me say, "Grandma Helen?" I turned around to find Emma standing there, her eyes wide with surprise and something that looked like relief. She was with Jennifer's mother, who had apparently moved back from Florida to help with childcare, or perhaps to provide a buffer between Emma and her father. "Emma!" I knelt down to her level, my heart racing. "How are you, sweetheart?" She looked around nervously, then whispered, "I miss you, Grandma. Why don't you come over anymore?" The grandmother, Patricia, looked uncomfortable but not hostile. "Hello, Helen," she said quietly. "We're just picking up a few things." Emma stepped closer to me, and I could see that her left wrist was in a small brace. "What happened to your arm, honey?" "I fell down the stairs," she said automatically, the explanation rolling off her tongue with practiced ease. But her eyes told a different story, a story of fear and secrets that no 8-year-old should have to carry. Patricia must have seen something in my face because she took Emma's hand gently. "We should go, sweetheart. Your mom is waiting in the car." But before they left, Emma looked back at me with those 2 wise eyes and whispered words that would haunt me for weeks. "I wish I could live with you, Grandma." That night, I called Dr. Walsh for an emergency session. "She's still being hurt," I told her, describing the encounter in the grocery store. "And there's nothing I can do about it. They've successfully cut me out of her life." "You're not powerless," Dr. Walsh reminded me. "You have documentation of the medical bills, you have your observations, and you have resources available to you. Have you contacted the Children's Advocacy Center that Maria told you about?" I had carried their card in my purse for months but had been too afraid to make the call. What if they didn't believe me? What if Michael was right and I was just an interfering grandmother who was imagining abuse where none existed? What if involving outside authorities made things worse for Emma? "Fear is keeping you from protecting your granddaughter," Dr. Walsh said gently. "But Emma doesn't have the luxury of your fear. She needs an advocate, and right now, you're the only one willing to fill that role." That afternoon, I made the call. The Children's Advocacy Center was located in a nondescript building in Flushing, designed to look as unthreatening as possible. The social worker who met with me, James Rodriguez, was a kind man in his 30s who listened to my story without judgment. "What you're describing, the pattern of injuries, the secrecy around medical bills, the child's fearful behavior, these are consistent with physical abuse," he said, after I'd shared everything I knew. "But I want you to understand what reporting this means. Once we open an investigation, there's no controlling how it unfolds. What happens to Emma during the investigation? That depends on what we find. She might remain in the home with additional oversight, or she might be placed temporarily with other family members while we sort things out." Other family members. That could mean me. I thought about Emma's whispered words in the grocery store. "I wish I could live with you, Grandma." Maybe that wasn't just a child's fantasy. Maybe it was a plea for help that I was finally ready to hear. "I want to file a report," I said. The investigation process was more complex than I'd imagined. Social workers interviewed Emma at school, away from her parents' influence. Medical records were subpoenaed and reviewed by specialists who knew how to identify patterns of abuse. Emma's teachers were interviewed about her behavior, her injuries, her explanations for accidents that didn't quite make sense. During this time, I was not allowed to have contact with Emma or her parents. The waiting was excruciating. Every day I wondered if I was making the right choice, if my intervention was helping or making things worse. Then came the phone call that changed everything. "Mrs. Martinez," James Rodriguez's voice was gentle but serious. "I need you to come to the hospital. Emma is here, and she's asking for you." The emergency room at New York Presbyterian was a chaos of sounds and lights that brought back memories of all those previous visits, all those accidents that had brought Emma here before. But this time was different. This time, someone had finally listened to what Emma's injuries were trying to tell us. I found her in a small room in the pediatric unit, her father nowhere in sight. Her left arm was in a cast, and there were bruises on her neck that made my stomach turn. "Grandma Helen," she said when she saw me, tears streaming down her small face. "You came." "Of course I came, sweetheart. I'll always come when you need me." Maria was there too, having been called in because she'd been Emma's primary nurse during so many previous admissions. She squeezed my shoulder gently as I sat down beside Emma's bed. "The doctors want to keep her for a few days," Maria explained quietly, "for observation and other evaluations." Emma reached for my hand with her uninjured arm. "Grandma, I have to tell someone the truth. I'm tired of lying." And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, my granddaughter told me what I'd suspected but had been too afraid to fully acknowledge. The falls that weren't falls. The accidents that happened when she didn't do her homework fast enough, when she spilled something, when she cried too loud or asked too many questions. "It was him," she whispered, her small hand gripping mine. "My dad. He gets so angry and then—" The words that followed were the most heartbreaking and the most validating I'd ever heard. Emma's truth confirmed every instinct I'd had, every concern I'd voiced, every boundary I'd set. I hadn't been crazy or confused or overly dramatic. I had been a grandmother who saw the truth and had the courage to act on it. "You're safe now," I told her, smoothing her hair away from her bruised face. "You're safe, and you don't have to go back there anymore." The legal proceedings that followed were complex and sometimes painful. Michael was arrested and charged with child abuse. Jennifer, who claimed she hadn't known about the physical violence, lost custody temporarily while the court determined whether she could protect Emma going forward. During the custody hearing, I sat in the gallery and watched my son, the little boy I'd once carried on my shoulders, the young man whose college education I'd paid for, the father I'd supported through every financial crisis. As he sat at the defendant's table trying to explain away years of systematic abuse, I felt grief for the man he could have been, for the father Emma deserved, for the son I'd thought I'd raised. But I felt no regret about my choices. Every boundary I'd set, every no I'd said, every dollar I'd refused to give had led to this moment, Emma's safety and my own liberation. The judge awarded me temporary custody of Emma while the family court sorted out the long-term arrangements. Taking custody meant I became responsible for an 8-year-old again at age 73, but it also meant Emma would be safe, loved and valued for who she was, instead of being treated as a target for someone else's anger. "Are you sure about this, Mrs. Martinez?" the social worker asked me as we filled out the paperwork. "Raising a child at your age? It's a big responsibility." I looked across the courthouse hallway at Emma, who was coloring in a book with intense concentration, her cast covered in drawings that Maria had helped her make. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I'm sure." 3 months after Emma came to live with me, we had established our own routines, our own traditions, our own definition of family. She helped me choose paint colors for her new bedroom, a soft yellow that reminded us both of sunshine. We had pancakes for dinner sometimes, just because we wanted to. We went to the library every Tuesday and the park every Saturday, weather permitting. Most evenings, after she finished her homework, we'd sit on my couch and watch old Disney movies or read books together. These were quiet, peaceful times that I treasured more than I could express. Emma was still in therapy, learning to process her trauma and understand that the violence she'd experienced wasn't her fault. But she was laughing more, sleeping better, and beginning to act like the child she'd never had the chance to be. "Grandma Helen," she said one evening as we were getting ready for bed, "why didn't anyone believe me when I tried to tell them Daddy was hurting me?" The question broke my heart because I knew the answer. Adults often overlook signs of abuse because seeing them requires action, requires difficult choices, requires standing up to people we love. It's easier to explain away suspicious injuries than to confront the possibility that someone we trust is capable of cruelty. "Sometimes grown-ups don't want to see things that are too hard to handle," I told her honestly. "But that's not your fault, sweetheart. You were very brave to tell the truth." "Will you always believe me?" she asked, her voice small in the darkness of her room. "Always," I promised. "No matter what." One Tuesday afternoon, as Emma and I were walking home from the library, she stopped suddenly in the middle of the sidewalk. "Grandma, I want to tell you something." "What is it, honey?" She looked up at me with those serious eyes that had seen too much but were learning to trust again. "You're my hero." Her words hit me with an emotional force I hadn't expected. Hero. This little girl who had survived abuse, who had found the courage to tell the truth, who was learning to heal from trauma, she saw me as her hero. For 73 years, I'd measured my worth by how much I could give, how much I could sacrifice, how much abuse I could absorb for the sake of keeping others comfortable. But Emma was teaching me that real heroism sometimes means saying no, setting boundaries, and protecting the vulnerable even when it costs you everything else. "You know what, Emma?" I said, kneeling down to her level right there on the sidewalk. "You're my hero, too." We hugged there among the usual chaos of Queens street life, buses honking, people rushing past, the familiar sounds and smells of our neighborhood swirling around us. But in that moment, we were complete. We were enough. We were family in the truest sense of the word. 6 months had passed since Emma came to live with me permanently. The custody battle was over. Michael had lost his parental rights entirely after the criminal trial, and Jennifer had agreed to supervised visits only. Emma was thriving in her new environment, her grades improving, her nightmares becoming less frequent. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror one morning, preparing for another ordinary day in our new life, and I hardly recognized the woman looking back at me. Gone was the exhausted, anxious person who had lived in fear of disappointing others. In her place was someone calmer, clearer, more sure of herself than I'd ever been. This wasn't the woman who had baked muffins she couldn't afford to keep ungrateful people happy. This wasn't the grandmother who had allowed financial manipulation to continue for years because she was afraid of being alone. This wasn't the mother who had enabled abuse because confronting it was too painful. This was someone who had found her voice and chosen justice over peace, truth over comfort, love over fear. The years of pain that had nearly broken me had instead transformed me into someone capable of transformation. The financial exploitation, the emotional manipulation, the gaslighting, the public humiliation, all of it had been necessary preparation for the most important thing I would ever do: save Emma's life and reclaim my own. As the sun set behind the familiar skyline of Queens that evening, I sat in my kitchen with a glass of red wine, a small luxury I now allowed myself, and reflected on how dramatically my life had changed. My suitcase sat packed by the door, ready for a weekend trip Emma and I had planned to the Adirondacks. We were going to hike easy trails, collect autumn leaves, and tell stories around a campfire at the lodge where we were staying. The woman I had been would never have planned such a trip, would never have believed she deserved such simple pleasures. But the woman I had become understood that joy, like love, shouldn't be earned through suffering. It should be embraced as a natural part of a life lived with dignity and purpose. My phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "How are my two favorite ladies doing tonight?" I sent back a photo of Emma at the kitchen table, working on a science project about butterflies, her tongue poking out slightly as she concentrated on her drawings of chrysalises, transforming into winged creatures. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. "We're perfect," I typed back. And for the first time in my adult life, that word felt accurate. But the story doesn't end with just personal transformation. As the weeks turned into months, I began to understand that my experience was far from unique. Through my work at the food pantry, through conversations at Emma's school, through connections at Dr. Walsh's support group that I'd joined, I discovered that there were others, grandmothers especially, who had walked similar paths. There was Rosa, whose adult son had manipulated her into remortgaging her house to pay for his gambling debts, leaving her on the verge of homelessness in her 70s. There was Mrs. Chen, whose daughter-in-law had convinced her son to cut off contact after she'd expressed concerns about her grandson's persistent clumsiness that resulted in far too many emergency room visits. There was Dorothy, whose family had convinced her she was developing dementia when she questioned why her great-granddaughter seemed afraid of her own stepfather. These women, strong, intelligent, loving grandmothers who had spent decades caring for others, had been systematically isolated, manipulated, and silenced by the very people they'd devoted their lives to supporting. Their stories were different in the details but identical in the patterns. Financial exploitation disguised as family emergencies, emotional manipulation wrapped in guilt and obligation, concerns dismissed as confusion or mental decline. In our monthly meetings at the community center, we shared not just our stories but our strategies for healing. We talked about the difficulty of setting boundaries with adult children who had learned to weaponize our love against us. We discussed the challenge of rebuilding self-worth after years of being valued only for what we could provide, rather than who we were. We supported each other through the grief of losing relationships that had never been as loving as we'd believed them to be. "The hardest part," Rosa said during one particularly emotional session, "is accepting that some of our children became people we didn't raise. Somewhere along the way, they learned that love was something to exploit rather than cherish." Dr. Walsh, who facilitated our group, helped us understand that this wasn't our failure as mothers. "You gave them the tools for empathy, kindness, and healthy relationships," she explained. "What they chose to do with those tools was ultimately their decision, not your responsibility." Emma became a source of hope for all of us, not just for me. When she would occasionally attend our meetings, playing quietly in the corner while we talked, The women would see what was possible when someone chooses protection over peace. They would watch her laugh at something on her tablet, see her run to hug me when our session ended, witness the easy affection between us that comes from a relationship built on genuine love rather than obligation. "She's what it looks like when a child feels truly safe," Dorothy observed one evening. "Look how different she is from 6 months ago." It was true. Emma had grown in ways that went far beyond healing from trauma. She was developing her own voice, her own opinions, her own sense of what she deserved from the people who claimed to love her. She had learned from watching me set boundaries that it was possible to say no to people in authority, to question explanations that didn't make sense, to trust her own instincts about safety and danger. One evening, as I helped her with her homework, she looked up at me with those eyes that were learning to hold hope instead of fear. "Grandma, when I grow up, I want to help kids like me. Kids who are scared and don't know who to tell. What kind of help do you want to give them? I want to teach them that it's okay to tell the truth even when the grown-ups don't want to hear it. And I want to show them that there are people like you, people who will believe them and keep them safe." Her words reminded me of something I'd been thinking about for weeks. My transformation hadn't just saved Emma and reclaimed my own life. It had shown me that there were countless other children and grandmothers who needed voices, advocates, people willing to speak truth even when it was uncomfortable or costly. I started small. When neighbors made comments about the Facebook post from months earlier, trying to fish for gossip about my strange behavior, I responded with simple truth instead of shame or defensiveness. I reported suspected child abuse to the appropriate authorities. I would say calmly, "It was investigated and confirmed. Sometimes protecting children requires difficult choices." The conversations that followed these responses were often awkward, but they were also educational. Several neighbors admitted they'd had their own concerns about situations in their extended families. Grandchildren with suspicious injuries, elderly relatives being financially exploited, family members whose stories didn't quite add up. My willingness to speak plainly about uncomfortable realities gave others permission to voice their own previously unspoken worries. Mrs. Kowalski, whose house I'd cleaned years earlier when I was struggling financially, stopped me at the grocery store one afternoon. "Helen, I owe you an apology. When I saw that post online, I thought the worst. But then I heard what was really happening, what you did for Emma. You saved that little girl." "I should have acted sooner," I admitted, because the guilt about Emma's earlier injuries still haunted me sometimes. "But you acted," she said firmly. "When it mattered most, when she needed you to be strong, you chose her safety over your comfort. That takes courage most of us don't have." These conversations taught me something important. Many people want to do the right thing, but don't know how to navigate the complex emotions and relationships involved in confronting abuse. They need examples of ordinary people who found extraordinary courage, not because they were naturally brave, but because something they loved more than their own fear was at stake. A year after Emma came to live with me, I was invited to speak at a training session for social workers at the Children's Advocacy Center. James Rodriguez had asked me to share my perspective as a family member who had successfully advocated for a child victim. Standing in that room full of professionals, looking at faces that had seen every variation of family dysfunction and child abuse, I felt simultaneously intimidated and determined. These people dealt with cases like Emma's every day. What could I possibly tell them that they didn't already know? But as I shared my story, the years of ignored instincts, the fear of family rejection that had nearly cost Emma her safety, the moment when love overcame fear, I saw recognition in their faces. Not just professional understanding, but personal resonance. During the question period afterward, a young social worker raised her hand. "What would you say to other grandparents who suspect abuse but are afraid to report it?" I thought about all the women in my support group, about the years I'd spent paralyzed by fear, about the cost of silence versus the cost of speaking up. "I would tell them that children can't wait for us to overcome our fears," I said. "I would tell them that losing relationships built on manipulation and enabling isn't actually a loss. It's a liberation. And I would tell them that their grandchildren need them to be heroes more than they need them to be peacekeepers." Another hand went up. "How do we help family members recognize the signs of this kind of manipulation and exploitation? Teach them to recognize the patterns," I replied. "The way love becomes transactional. The way concerns get dismissed as overreaction or mental decline. The way family emergencies always seem to require the same person's financial rescue. Help them understand that real love doesn't feel like walking on eggshells, and real family doesn't demand silence about abuse in exchange for belonging." After the training session, several of the social workers approached me privately. They shared stories about their own families, parents who were being financially exploited, children whose injuries raised questions no one wanted to ask, relatives whose demands for help had become manipulative and overwhelming. "It's different when it's your own family," one of them admitted. All that professional training goes out the window when it's your mother or your sister or your nephew who needs you to see the truth. The invitation to speak led to others. Community centers, church groups, senior service organizations, they all wanted to hear from someone who had navigated the complex terrain of family dysfunction and emerged with both dignity and relationships intact. I began to understand that my story wasn't just about personal healing. It was about modeling a different way of responding to manipulation and abuse within families. Emma often accompanied me to these speaking engagements, sometimes sharing her own perspective about what it felt like to have someone finally listen to her truth. Her presence was powerful in ways that went beyond words. Seeing a child who was healthy, happy, and clearly beloved made the stakes of family advocacy concrete and personal for audience members. When Grandma Helen chose to believe me instead of my dad's stories about accidents, she saved my life. Emma would tell audiences with a clarity that belied her age. Sometimes the people who hurt us are people we're supposed to love, and that makes it really hard for grown-ups to see the truth. But kids need grown-ups who will see it anyway. Her willingness to speak publicly about her experience was partly therapeutic. Her counselor encouraged her to share her story as a way of processing trauma, but it was also educational. Adults who heard an articulate child describe the experience of being abused and disbelieved by most of her family were less likely to dismiss similar concerns in their own lives. The speaking engagements also connected me with other advocates, other grandparents who had made similar difficult choices, other professionals who understood the unique challenges of family-based advocacy. I learned about legal resources I hadn't known existed, support services that could help families navigate the complex process of reporting abuse, therapeutic interventions that address the specific trauma of being betrayed by parents or caregivers. One evening, as Emma and I walked home from the library through our Queens neighborhood, she asked me something that had clearly been on her mind for a while. "Grandma, do you miss Daddy at all? Do you miss how things used to be before the courts and the social workers and everything?" It was a fair question, and one that deserved an honest answer. "I miss the little boy your daddy used to be," I told her. "I miss believing that he was still that sweet child who told me all his secrets and hugged me like I was the most important person in his world. But Emma, he wasn't that person anymore. Maybe he never really was, and I just wanted to believe it so badly that I ignored the signs that he'd become someone dangerous. Do you think he ever loved us?" The question broke my heart, because I couldn't give her the reassurance she was looking for. The truth was complicated and painful, but it was still truth. I think he loved the idea of having people who would always forgive him, always help him, always make excuses for his behavior. But that's not the same as loving us for who we actually are. Real love doesn't require you to stay quiet about being hurt. Real love doesn't demand that you choose between speaking truth and belonging to the family. We walked in comfortable silence for a while, passing the familiar landmarks of our shared life. The bodega where we bought milk, the park where Emma played after school, the bus stop where we waited together on mornings when I walked her to school. "I'm glad you chose truth," she said finally. "Even though it was scary and people said mean things about you, I'm glad you chose me. I'll always choose you, sweetheart, and I'll always choose truth, even when it's hard." That conversation reminded me of something I'd learned over the past year of transformation. Healing isn't a destination. It's an ongoing process of choosing courage over comfort, truth over convenience, love over fear. Every day brought opportunities to practice those choices in small ways, setting boundaries with intrusive neighbors, refusing to engage with family members who wanted to debate my decisions, maintaining Emma's stability and security even when it required extra energy or resources. The holiday season brought particular challenges. Christmas had always been a time when family dysfunction got magnified, when the pressure to maintain traditions and appearances often overrode concerns about actual emotional health and safety. Emma's first Christmas with me was an opportunity to create new traditions that prioritized joy and authenticity over obligation and performance. Instead of the elaborate, expensive celebrations I'd once orchestrated to try to buy my family's happiness, Emma and I planned simple activities that we both genuinely enjoyed. We baked cookies not because it was expected, but because we liked the process of measuring ingredients and licking batter from spoons together. We decorated our tree with ornaments Emma made in art class and photos of our favorite memories from the past year. We watched Christmas movies and read holiday stories and talked about what traditions we wanted to keep, modify, or abandon entirely. "This feels different from before," Emma observed as we sat on the couch Christmas morning, surrounded by modest gifts we'd chosen thoughtfully for each other. "It feels more like love, I guess, instead of like a show we had to put on." Her observation was profound. So much of what I'd thought was family closeness had actually been performance. elaborate productions designed to create the appearance of love and connection without addressing the underlying dysfunction that made real intimacy impossible. This quieter, simpler Christmas was actually more emotionally rich because it was built on genuine affection rather than obligation and manipulation. By spring, Emma had been living with me for almost a year, and the changes in both of us were remarkable. She rarely woke up from nightmares anymore. Her grades had improved significantly. She'd made friends at school and joined the art club, where her teachers praised her creativity and emotional intelligence. The fearful, hypervigilant child I'd first brought home from the hospital had blossomed into a confident young girl who knew she was valued, protected, and loved unconditionally. For my part, the transformation was equally dramatic. The chronic anxiety that had plagued me for years had mostly lifted. I slept better, ate better, and moved through my days with a sense of purpose and contentment I'd never experienced before. The financial stress that had once consumed my thoughts had eased significantly. Without the constant demands from Michael and Jennifer, my modest Social Security income was sufficient for our simple lifestyle. More importantly, the emotional weight of constantly managing other people's crises and manipulations was gone, leaving space for creativity, friendship, and genuine peace. Dr. Walsh, who had continued to meet with me periodically, observed during one of our sessions that my journey represented a kind of late-in-life coming-of-age story. You've discovered who you are when you're not defined primarily by your relationships to other people, she noted. Many people never get the opportunity to find out what they're capable of when they're not spending all their energy managing dysfunction. The support group I'd joined had evolved as well. Several of the original members had made significant changes in their own family relationships. Rosa had set firm financial boundaries with her gambling-addicted son and was slowly rebuilding her economic security. Mrs. Chen had reconnected with her grandson after his father's arrest for domestic violence. Dorothy had moved closer to her great-granddaughter and become an active part of her care team after her concerns about the stepfather were validated by a school counselor. We'd also welcomed new members, women at various stages of recognizing and addressing family dysfunction. Some were dealing with financial exploitation, others with emotional manipulation, still others with concerns about abuse or neglect of grandchildren. Our meetings had become a kind of informal training ground where experience and wisdom were shared, where women learned to trust their instincts and find their voices. What I've learned, I told a newcomer to the group one evening, is that protecting the people we love sometimes requires us to stop protecting the people who hurt them. And sometimes those are the same people, which makes the choice excruciating. But children can't wait for us to resolve our conflicted feelings about their abusers. That spring also brought unexpected contact from parts of my family I hadn't heard from since the custody battle. Lisa, my youngest daughter, called from California after months of silence. "Mom, I've been thinking about what happened," she said carefully. "About Emma and Michael and everything. I wanted to apologize for not taking your concerns seriously. The apology was welcome, but I'd learned to listen for substance rather than just sentiment." "What changed your mind?" "My friend Sarah. Not my sister Sarah, but my friend. She went through something similar with her brother-in-law. Child Protective Services got involved, and it turned out her instincts had been right all along. It made me realize that maybe you weren't confused or overreacting. Maybe you were just the only one brave enough to speak up. It was a start. But I'd learned to be cautious about reconciliation attempts that weren't accompanied by accountability or changed behavior. Lisa, I appreciate your apology, but I need you to understand that my relationship with you going forward depends on your ability to respect the choices I've made and the boundaries I've set. I won't go back to being the family member who absorbs everyone else's problems while my own concerns are dismissed." "I understand," she said, and she sounded like she meant it. "I'd like to get to know Emma, if that's okay. And I'd like to be part of your life in a healthy way." Rebuilding relationships with family members who had initially been unsupportive required careful navigation. I insisted on gradual contact, clear boundaries, and ongoing demonstration that the patterns of dismissal and manipulation had genuinely changed. Lisa's first visit with Emma and me was brief and structured, a lunch at a neutral restaurant where we could all assess comfort levels without the pressure of an extended interaction. Emma was curious about this aunt she barely remembered, but also appropriately cautious. Her experiences had taught her to pay attention to how adults treated her and each other, to notice discrepancies between words and actions, to trust her instincts about safety and respect. "She seems nice," Emma said after Lisa had left, "but I want to make sure she really understands what happened and why you had to protect me." Her wisdom continued to amaze me. At 9 years old, Emma had developed sophisticated skills for evaluating relationships and protecting her own emotional well-being. She'd learned that love shouldn't require her to ignore her own needs or minimize her own experiences. She'd learned that healthy relationships were built on mutual respect and genuine care rather than obligation and guilt. As our first year together drew to a close, I reflected on how completely my understanding of family, love, and personal strength had been transformed. The woman who had started this journey terrified of being alone had discovered that there was a profound difference between being alone and being lonely. I had been surrounded by people for decades while feeling fundamentally isolated and misunderstood. Now, with my smaller but healthier circle of relationships, I felt genuinely connected and supported. Emma and I had created something I'd never experienced before. A family based on choice rather than obligation, built on truth rather than convenience, sustained by genuine affection rather than manipulation and guilt. It was smaller than what I'd once considered my family, but it was immeasurably stronger, healthier, and more loving. The evening before our first anniversary of living together, Emma asked if she could write me a letter. She'd been working on her writing skills in school and wanted to practice expressing complex thoughts on paper. "Dear Grandma Helen," she read to me from her carefully printed note. "Thank you for saving me. Thank you for believing me when no one else would. Thank you for being brave, even when it was scary. Thank you for showing me what love really looks like. I used to think love meant keeping secrets and being quiet when people hurt you. Now I know that love means keeping people safe and telling the truth even when it's hard. You are the best grandma in the world, and I'm proud to be your granddaughter. Love, Emma." If you've ever lived, or known someone who lived, something like this, the slow erosion of self-worth, the financial exploitation disguised as family need, the fear of setting boundaries because loneliness felt worse than abuse, please share your story in the comments. Your voice matters, and your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find their own courage. Maybe you're watching this video because you recognize yourself in my story. Maybe you're questioning whether the treatment you're receiving from family members is normal, healthy, or loving. Maybe you're wondering if speaking up about suspected abuse is worth the risk of losing relationships that feel precious despite their toxicity. I want you to know that your instincts are probably right. That voice inside you that says, "This isn't normal," or "This doesn't feel like love," is worth listening to. The small compromises you make every day to keep peace, the boundaries you don't set to avoid conflict, the truths you don't speak to prevent abandonment, all of these choices have consequences not just for you, but for the vulnerable people in your life who need advocates more than they need silence. And if you found strength in my story, if you recognized your own journey toward liberation and self-worth in these words, please like this video and subscribe. Together, we can create a community of people who choose healing over harmony, truth over comfort, and love that empowers instead of love that exploits. We heal together, one story at a time, one boundary at a time, one rescued granddaughter at a time. The transformation is possible. The courage is within you, and you are never too old, never too invested, never too afraid to choose yourself and the people who need your protection most. Your voice matters. Your truth matters. Your boundaries matter. And somewhere, maybe closer than you think, someone is waiting for you to be brave enough to speak up for them the way I finally spoke up for Emma. The sunset looks different when you're watching it from a place of peace instead of pain, from freedom instead of fear. And I promise you, it's worth every difficult conversation, every lost relationship, every moment of uncertainty it takes to get there. You deserve that sunset too.